really prioritize your values, because, and it's tricky as a scientist, and you see this when you're training graduate students, is that, well, you have to follow the science properly, and you have to be skeptical of your own results, and you have to be sure you're not publishing merely so that you publish and merely to burnish your reputation. And the same thing with attending conferences. On the other hand, you do have to publish and you have to market and communicate. There is a career development element to every enterprise. Now, the question then becomes, well, what do you do when those are set at odds with one another? And the answer is, well, if you're tilting towards pathological narcissism, you sacrifice the mission for the message. And there's plenty of corruption in science that's merely a consequence of that. But when you're backed into a corner the way you were, then you have to really start to understand what that means. It's like, are you in this to do the good that hypothetically motivates the science? Or are you going to sacrifice that, apologize, kowtow, and hypothetically protect your reputation? And you're done as a scientist if you do that. I think you're done as an ethical actor.
I think you're done as a human being.
You are. And you don't protect yourself against the mob, because all that's happened is they've fundamentally emasculated you, and you've been eliminated as a credible threat. It's a very bad strategy. So it's a relief to hear that you were able to see your pathway forward in the summer. I'm sure that was utterly brutal. It's hard to communicate to people just exactly what it's like to be a respected scientific practitioner and then to have all of that inverted, and to see your colleagues fail to support you or participate in the inversion. It's quite the illuminating experience. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I understood how excommunication worked.
Right, exactly.
That's what it felt like.
Yeah, you bet, because that's that betrayal and excommunication. That's exactly what it is. So then, okay, so you decided that you were the devil take the hindmost, and that you were going to say what you needed, what you believed to be true. And so, what occurred then?
So fast forward a few months. There was my colleague Scott Atlas was advising the president of the United States, and so I actually got to meet with the president. But that never went anywhere. The American president at the time, President Trump, he was. I think his instincts were against the lockdowns, but he basically thought that if he let Tony Fauci not have the reins, that he would lose the election. And so that was quite frustrating. Fast forward a few months to October 2020, and a colleague of mine from Harvard, Martin Kulldorff, who's a fantastic biostatistician, he helped design the vaccine safety surveillance statistical systems that the FDA and the CDC use in the US with the statistical work, invited me and Sunetra Gupta, who's a great epidemiologist at Oxford University, to a small conference in Great Barrington, Massachusetts.
Yep.
We arrived basically just to compare notes. Like, we weren't thinking about issuing a statement or anything, but we realized that we'd arrived at the same place regarding the strategy of how to manage the pandemic. The summer had seen a decline in cases. There's some spread in like Arizona and the South and some countries, but the threat of March seemed to have subsided. But it was really clear from the data that the disease was coming back in the fall, that there was going to be spread of the disease again. And it was also clear to me as a social scientist looking at the pattern of political action that the lockdowns were also going to come back, because the fear was not gone, the disgust was not gone, all of that was still in place. All the infrastructure for the lockdowns were there. And so what we wrote this very short document, 1 page long, called the Great Barrington Declaration. We wrote it in very simple language because we wanted to reach regular people. Because I thought to myself, and we thought to ourselves, that it was really regular people that needed to know that there wasn't a consensus in favor of the lockdown.
Yeah.
That people were being misled, that the idea that all scientists agreed that there was a consensus, that the science said, let's lock down, was not true.
Yep.
In fact, many, many reputable scientists disagreed with that, and yet they stayed silent because of the fear of social ostracism, fear of, Tony Fauci controls billions of dollars of federal money for research. What's not just the money so that you can do your experiments, it controls the social status of scientists. You don't get tenure at a top university, medical university, unless you get NIH funding.
Yep.
In the United States. So it's the social status as well as even more than the money itself.
Well, it's not just the social status either. We should be clear about that. It's also your livelihood itself, right? Because so it isn't merely the fact that you want to elevate yourself up the status hierarchy. It's that you want to keep your job. And so this is nuts and bolts. This is nuts and bolts material here. Yeah, you know, I was very ill when the Great Barrington Declaration came out, so I wasn't as what would you say, aware of everything that was going on as I might have been under different conditions. But one of the things I do remember, and I've been struck by this continually, is that while it was demonized and put off to the side as the work of essentially like scientific outsiders and extremists. And what's so interesting about that, I found this repeatedly because I've talked to a lot of reprehensible people over the last few years, such as yourself. And I found that even though I know as well as anyone how easy it is for people to be demonized for their views and how often that's purely an invention of psychopathic narcissists, very often, trying to score points at the expense of someone's reputation. It's still the case that even the smallest slur in relationship to someone's professional reputation is enough to make even me skeptical about who I'm talking to. Because you think, it's very hard to think, well, if there's enough smoke, there's probably some fire, right? And that's actually a pretty intelligent rule of thumb decision because there's 7 billion people out there. You're not going to listen to all of them. And so one way you cut through the complexity of figuring out who to listen to is you don't listen to people whose reputations have been savaged. And you don't have time to sort that out like a legal trial, you know, but what it does mean is that reputation savaging can be weaponized, and there are people who are absolutely stellar at that. And the Great Barrington Declaration was definitely savaged, ignored and savaged both. And so it launched when? And this was in 2020.
Yeah, October 4th, 2020. I mean, people that like tens of thousands of doctors and epidemiologists signed it. Nobel Prize winners signed it. Like almost 1 million people have signed it to date. It went viral very rapidly. Like we just put it on a web page and people just found it. And I started getting messages from people saying, thanking me for like saying common sense, protect vulnerable people, lift the lockdowns. Those are the two ideas of the Great Barrington. It's the old pandemic plan. It's the least original thing I've ever written in my entire life. I mean, there's nothing new actually in it.
And certainly nothing radical.
I didn't think so. But 4 days after we wrote it,